Good morning. I want to thank Professor Gwynne Campbell and Dr. Philip Gooding for this opportunity to speak at this first conference of the IOWC Network for Slavery, Bondage, and the Environment in the Indian Ocean World about aspects of my work concerning coerced and dependent labor, global markets, and patterns of consumption and desire in the Trans-Pacific region in the early modern period. My paper analyzes some environmental impacts of the Spanish founding of Manila and the advent of the Trans-Pacific trade on the Philippines in the early modern period. Filipinos have been taught that these events associated with the wider history of the Asia-Pacific region and Spanish Empire brought in their wake civilization, progress, and development. More recently, others, writing regional and environmental history, have described the discovery and conquest of the Philippines as a cultural encounter between two very different worlds. The environmental repercussions of this collision, prolonged relationship and conflict, have affected the Philippines for over 450 years. In this third decade of the 21st century, many Filipinos live in conditions of poverty caused by nearly 5 centuries of political and economic domination and its consequential environmental destruction. Ferdinand Magellan, the Portuguese navigator who sailed under the flag of Castile y Leon, set out from Spain in 1519 with 5 ships to find a westward passage to the fabled Spice Islands. 3 years after the expedition left Spain, only the Victoria returned home. Its hold was filled with 26 tons of cloves, which made the expedition a huge financial success. 4 more unsuccessful Spanish expeditions set sail in search of such fabulous spices, gold, personal gain, and for souls to convert to the Catholic religion. The Philippines was eventually established as a colony in 1565 under the governorship of Miguel de Legazpi. In 1571, Legazpi chose Manila as the capital because of its excellent harbor and abundant hinterland that could supply the city with the necessary produce and natural resources. The Manila settlement itself rose on the eastern shores of a delta at the mouth of the Pasig River. A small Chinese population was already in the Philippines when the Spanish arrived, and there already existed a well-established inter-island trade with Southeast China. The Spaniards took advantage of Manila's commanding position and transformed the landscape, employing models of town life from Spain. Corvée labor was used to build the Intramuros district with its royal houses, casas reales, fortifications, port facilities, warehouses, shipyards, foundries, churches, convents, private residences, and roads. Intramuros was the heart and soul of Spanish civil, religious, military, and commercial activity in the islands and the seat of civil and ecclesiastical authority. The location of the walled city on the large Manila Bay made the port a center of cross-cultural commerce between Asia and the Americas that brought Chinese and Japanese traders to the Philippines. Effectively, Intramuros was the financial center and hub for the galleon trade that carried Chinese silk, porcelain, and Philippine products to Mexico, and it would become the western terminus of the highly lucrative Trans-Pacific trade that linked Manila to Spain. In the age of Spanish dominion, the oceans of the globe were great connectors with vast highways of cross-cultural commerce between the Philippines, the Americas, and Spain. Technological innovation, square sails, and the axial or centerline rudder enabled the Spanish to dominate the oceans of the globe, establishing a far-flung mercantilist network of trade and communication in the early phase of European expansion. As noted earlier, a small Chinese population was already established in the islands when the Spanish arrived. While the Chinese sent their annual trading junks to the Philippines, Tagalogs conveyed most of the trade wares in smaller sailing ships to different parts of the archipelago. The ensuing Spanish arrival in the Philippines in the 1560s provided the missing trans-Pacific connection and enabled the southern Chinese to continue to expand their trade and markets across the Pacific to the Americas. In 1565, Friar André de Urdaneta, an Augustinian, navigated the first European eastward passage, sailing north to Japan, and he then caught the eastbound current to the south coast of California, Baja California. 8 years later, the world's longest voyage of trade and navigation began when a Spanish galleon laden with the fabled treasures of Ming China arrived in Acapulco in 1573. Navigation of the Pacific Ocean linked the two continents, and Mexicans, Chinese, Filipinos, and Japanese all traded their wares. At the height of the trade, huge galleons, built in the Philippines with draft labor, could transport up to 400 passengers, as well as an enormous cargo. Annual fairs were held in Manila and Acapulco, where Chinese silk, Indian cottons, and Asian ceramics could be exchanged for Mexican and Peruvian silver, and vice versa. For 250 years, between 1565 and 1815, the Philippines had no official communication with Spain, except that made possible by the Trans-Pacific crossing of the Nao de la China, or the ships of China, the great 3- or 4-masted galleons that traveled between the Philippines and the Viceroyalty of New Spain and Mexico. The Philippines was administered from Mexico, while its commerce centered on Manila, which functioned as an entrepot between Asia and the Pacific. A well-defended inlet afforded the best anchorage in Manila Bay and was a haven for these huge ships during typhoons and storms. The circulating capital invested in this trans-Pacific trade was enormous, but the length of the voyage and the risks entailed could also spell financial disaster for the markets and merchants of Manila and Acapulco. They could suddenly lose their investments as cargo and ships might be lost in a cyclonic storm, or during the 17th and 18th centuries, they might be attacked by the English buccaneers operating in the Pacific Ocean and Caribbean Sea. The 100-year period from 1580 to 1680 was the most decisive and formative stage of Spain's colonization of the Philippines, marked by frontier expansion in borderlands and an increase in the colony's resource demands and labor requirements. The Crown asserted its colonizing right in the Philippines to tribute, resource extraction, and the exploitation of labor. By 1610, the extended indigenous family, consisting of parents, children, and grandparents, was considered the principal unit for tribute payment, calculated at 20% of earnings. Such colonial economic and political practices as forced labor and production levies were commonly employed from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and they were crucially important to those Spanish living in the frontier areas, which were far distant from the Spanish authorities in Manila. The colonial government's introduction of a system of forced labor, Polo y Servicio, and the compulsory sale of local products to the authorities, Vandala, Tagalog for purchase, placed an economic and social strain on pre-Hispanic Filipino society. In part, this was because payment was often made for the goods and services by promissory notes issued by a colonial treasury that was typically unwilling to honor them. A 1658 report of the Manila Audiencia argued that the Vandala was an oppressive system of production designed to forcibly integrate Filipinos into the Manila-based Trans-Pacific economy. The document highlighted the nature of the government's onerous demands and expressed concerns about food self-sufficiency. It uncovered how enterprising merchants, royal magistrates, and alcalde mayores, governors, supplied goods on credit through means of the repartimiento, or distribution. The example given was the people of Ilocos, who were expected to pay for goods supplied with cash crops or other commodities. The reasons which compelled the previous governors to introduce the aforementioned vandalas and repartimientos of rice, coconut, oil, bonite, abaca, cotton cloth from Ilocos, and beans, wax, and other goods were to maintain supplies for the royal warehouses, the construction of galleons, and the cutting of timber for the aid of the garrisons or presidios at Ternate, Zamboanga, and other outposts of His Majesty's empire. The size of the labor force required to meet increased construction schedule for fortifications, garrisons, port facilities, and large sailing vessels, as well as road and bridge building, and the construction of residences and warehouses was enormous, aside from the necessary increased demand to produce food. The building of the Intramuros district in Manila, with its massive stone ramparts, moats, and walls, required a huge labor force of manual workers, stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths. The widespread use of stone and tile for government buildings, churches, and convents was possible due to the use of coerced independent labor. The construction of lime and stone stucco structures also required vast forest resources with which to stoke the kilns and an equally large supply of limestone and coral to produce the lime. The building techniques used accelerated the degradation of forests, land, and coastal reef systems in the archipelago. The harsh demands for food and labor also entailed the large-scale movement of populations by the government as Manila's long political and economic arm reached into its hinterland in the years between 1580 and 1640. Pampanga was particularly hard hit by the levies of draft labor. At times, thousands of able-bodied men would be relocated to work as laborers and timber cutters on the construction sites or in distant forests. In the early 1640s, when the fortification of Manila was needed, the government even drafted local women into labor gangs shepherded by armed guards. Both women and men, mostly unpaid, were drafted as coerced labor and were also forced to work through the planting and harvesting seasons. In these atrocious circumstances, the specter of hunger and famine were never far away for all inhabitants, especially in the harrowing years from 1638 to 1648. The Spanish municipal elite relied on the traditional status of the datus, the indigenous heads of the barangay or villages, to enforce the Polo y servicios that required forced labor for all males from 16 to 60 years old for a 40-day period, and then Vandala and collect taxes. Forced resettlement and the granting of honorific titles and commercial privileges to datus were among the strategies used by the Spanish to control indigenous labor while enhancing the status of the chiefly class under Spanish rule. As a result, datus had opportunities to increase their wealth and power, especially through the acquisition of land which their dependents cultivated. Traditional indigenous society, livelihood, and the environment were of little importance to Legazpi and his successors. All that mattered was to extract resources for the crown and maintain the Spanish galleons for the lucrative trans-Pacific trade between Asia and New Spain. The Trans-Pacific commerce and financial future of the colony rested on galleon building, the most important state-sponsored industry. Despite this, scant attention had been given to the scale of the timber felling in this period or to the size of the Filipino labor force employed by the Spanish crown to build these great vessels. The Luzon coast and the Visayas provided an abundance of timber and facilities for shipbuilding. At the height of the galleon trade, the colonial government divided shipbuilding activities into separate branches. The governor established royal shipyards, or astilleros, in the provinces. Sites for the building of large vessels were chosen close to vast timber reserves. Because of the galleon's bulk, it was difficult to transport logs for shipbuilding more than 15 to 20 kilometers unless they could be floated down a waterway. These shipbuilding yards were therefore often connected to neighboring hinterlands by rivers and their tributaries, down which extensive stocks of logs were sent to the shipbuilding sites. The wholesale clearing of forests for galleon construction and the use of waterways to transport the giant logs made the Spanish control of certain rivers and their forested hinterlands of strategic importance in the development of the state-based Manila-Acapulco trade economy. Major shipbuilding sites were established at Cavite, with several more on the Camarines coast and the Gulf of Sorsogon, at Bacatao in Albay province, on Marinduque, and on Mindoro, Masbate, Iloilo, and the east coast of Samar. Many galleons were built at Bacatao and on the Pangasinan coast north of Manila. The escalation of galleon building at these sites attracted population, increased the clustering of settlements, and led to the devastation of the surrounding environment. The strong hardwoods, teak and molave, were especially selected for galleon construction. The various yards for building the galleons were in different places from where the sails and ropes were manufactured. The cordage and rigging for the vessels were made from Manila hemp or abaca in the coastal towns of Albay, while the sailcloth came from the backstrap looms in northern Ilocos. The size of the shipyards varied, as did the workforce. The Pantao yards in Camarines employed 1,400 men during peak activity. Shipbuilders and their artisans received special commissions from the state to build galleons, and the construction deadlines were regularly met, even in times of war or social unrest. Most of the workforce was Filipino, but there were also Chinese artisans, Spanish administrators, guards, and labor overseers. Cavite, the largest yard and naval headquarters of the Spanish, required a labor force of more than 3,000 workers, mainly conscripted from Pampanga, Bataan, and neighboring provinces. The galleon building industry in Cavite used large numbers of workers forced into service, and Cavite became a boom town. Large-scale timber cutting for the galleons relied on mobilizing labor on an enormous scale to get the cut logs down the slopes. Huge tree trunks had to be manually dragged over land with log rollers to the riverbanks. Neither wheeled vehicles nor draft animals later used to haul logs to roads or riverbanks are mentioned in early accounts or dictionaries. Hernando de los Rios Coronel, Procurator General of the colony in the early 1620s, recognized the overall environmental impact of galleon building on communities in central Luzon. Quote, "It is necessary to depopulate the villages nearby, and it causes them great effort and disruption and great cost. The trees for one galleon cost the inhabitants of Laguna Bay so much that to drag the logs the 6 leagues, about 20 miles, from the high mountains requires 6,000 people working for 3 months without providing them with food, which they must find for themselves." End quote. Filipinos conscripted labor was essential for the difficult task of cutting and hauling timber from the hinterlands. These teams of loggers were excellent timber cutters and haulers. Pampangans were repeatedly called upon to supply workers, and large consignments of Pampangan timber, a favored wood for the galleon construction in the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1609, when coerced labor dramatically increased under Governor Don Juan de Silva, the most pressing need had been for woodcutters, haulers, shipwrights, and laborers to work in the increasing number of shipyards and foundries. A decade later, a letter written by the Augustinian procurator described this turning point in the social relations of production. Quote, "The Indios of the Philippine Islands experienced real prosperity and were at peace until 1609, when the governor Don Juan de Silva raised in these islands naval shipyards for the construction of armadas. And to accomplish this, he imposed heavy taxes and repartimientos on the Indios. In the decade 1610 to 1620, workers in the royal yards worked relentlessly around the clock without pay or food. In the same year, a letter penned by a judge from the Manila Audiencia reported that the Cavite yards had continued production nonstop for over 4 years, and that labor abuse was widespread. Between 1630 and 1650, the galleon trade suffered a shattering series of setbacks. The silver mines of Potosi collapsed after 1630 due to decaying infrastructure and declining yields, and the number of Chinese junks visiting Manila fell a decade later due to the political crisis in Ming China and a decline in trade. Typhoons wreaked havoc on the galleons throughout the 1630s and 40s. 11 galleons were lost to typhoons in the 15 years after 1638. Friars of the various religious orders said the disasters occurred because vessel construction was being done on Sundays and holy days, and because the laborers were often cheated of their pay. To cope with the galleon losses, the beleaguered government increased taxation and coerced labor in the rural societies of Luzon and the Visayas. The impacts of the state-sponsored galleon building project on families, groups, and institutions were profound. Morbidity and mortality were permanent features of the mercantilist political economy, and the death of forced laborers was considered an economic imperative in the construction of galleons. Spanish rule was remorseless and undeviating in its exploitation of labor. Free from all bourgeois illusions, this oldest of mercantilist countries reckoned silver, silk, timber, sugar cane, abaca, and subject people all as items on the crown's balance sheet. Individuals, households, and families were robbed of time and the capacity to properly pursue traditional livelihoods. Those men working in the timber cutting camps lacked the necessary time and energy to cultivate and harvest their crops. Crucially, the Spanish government did not have the capacity, or it seems the inclination, to prevent famine. The Manila authorities rarely provided promised wages and timely relief when serious food shortages occurred and mass starvation resulted in some areas of Luzon. To guarantee the future of the Trans-Pacific trade, the Spanish insisted that communities establish themselves along the strategic San Bernardino Strait. Palapag was a key settlement because of its proximity to the headlands of the strait through which all inward and outward shipping flowed. These communities on the northern coast of Samar were expected to erect their own fortifications, warehouses, and port facilities to deal with the flow of the galleon traffic. Trade restriction and corruption in the galleon trade flourished in the first few decades of the 17th century based on goods brought to Manila by the Chinese and others for transshipment by the Spanish to Mexico. In these early years, the galleon trade was not constrained by laws, and the ships returned each year from Acapulco in New Spain, bringing large profits on Mexican silver to meet the Manila government's needs. The first permiso, or restriction on the trade limiting the value of the annual cargo sent to New Spain, was established in 1593. The cargo was limited to 250,000 pesos in Manila, with a sales value in Mexico not to exceed double that amount. This same limit was extended by further decrees in 1604 and 1619, and by 1776, it had reached 750,000 pesos. The return value of the cargo did not change, and it was still set at double the permiso. After the imposition of the first permiso, galleons regularly carried tons of contraband cargo, so that the value of the cargo invariably exceeded the officially specified amount. Due to limited lading space, the cargo hold was divided into piezas, or sections, each with 4 parts. Officially, there were 4,000 sections. The need for additional lading space on galleons after 1593 meant that corruption soon spread to related matters such as the size of the ships. The building restrictions imposed on the size of the galleons went to 300 tons, then later to 560 tons, but these were never observed. By the start of the 18th century, Manila was dispatching galleons of 1,000 tons, and the Rosario, engaged in the trade between 1741 and 1761, had a formal lading space of 18,600 piezas at a time when the maximum number permitted was 4,000. The corruption was acknowledged by Governor Obando in his 1750 letter to the king, writing that the frauds in the system began in the original distribution of lading space, where self-interest, favoritism, or the claims of flesh and blood often dictated the list of recipients. Spain's Trans-Pacific trade was in part possible due to the Philippines having large teak and Malawi forests, hardwoods that were essential to galleon construction. Virgin forests covered almost 2/3 of the Philippines at the time, often growing close to the shoreline and extending deep into the hinterlands, across ridges and valleys to the peaks of mountain ranges. For the Spanish, these forests were the island's most valuable natural resource. After 1573, once the maritime Silk Road spanning the Pacific opened for business, the Philippines' magnificent forests stood exposed to the state-sponsored axe and to traditional slash-and-burn techniques. The impact of this plundering of the forests on the environmental and local populations is not yet fully accounted, but it is known that the insatiable demand for timber drove some hunter-gatherer and Swidden populations further into the hinterlands. In central Luzon, where the forested areas of Pampanga and parts of coastal Pangasinan attracted huge labor gangs, Juan Jose Delgado reported that these foresters held beliefs concerning, quote, when and how trees should be felled, end quote. However, Delgado noted, based on personal observations at San Mateo and Valeta, the gangs of loggers and official lumbermen were compelled to cut down the trees regardless of the time, type of weather, or period of the moon. The Pambangan woodcutters and other laborers had to regularly violate their age-old cultural, ecological, and spiritual beliefs about land use patterns and forest resource management. Huge amounts of wood fueled the forges and ironworks of the Cavite shipyard and arsenal, as well as those of other astilleros, driving the large-scale felling of trees in central Luzon. In a comparatively short space of time, neighboring forests were destroyed. One expert claimed an average ironworks in the pre-18th century period exploited 4,942 acres or 2,000 hectares of forest in a 2-year period. It took more than 2,000 large trees to build the galleon for the Manila-Acapulco trade. To supply lumber and firewood on such a huge scale meant that timber soon became scarce in areas that were previously densely forested. In the 17th century, when typhoons regularly crossed over Luzon and the Visayas, the stripped watersheds and bare hills could not soak up the precipitation, and this now led to landslides and flooding. Villages began to be washed away because of erosion, harvests were destroyed, and fields lost to inundation. Floods now became an increasing hazard to local livelihoods. This was not just the natural impacts of the typhoons, but rather the multiple cascading effects of typhoons and linked environmental devastation due to Spanish colonization, driven by the desire for profits from the Asia-Pacific trade. By the early 17th century, the Spanish had triggered the start of an environmental disaster in the colony, inaugurating the first of 2 major waves of forest predation. In the initial phase, the shipbuilding boom to sustain the galleon trade and stave off the Dutch threat stripped the forest in the areas around the capital and spots on other islands. Wood was essential to virtually all construction throughout the archipelago. All forms of transport, machines, and tools for agricultural and technological production also required wood. As timber became scarcer, the logs had to be transported over longer distances than ever before. In the Philippines, as in Mexico, consequent changes in the local regional economy linked to the galleon trade meant an irrevocable transformation of the natural landscape and marked the start of a social and environmental transition and transformation that has now lasted nearly 500 years. For the pre-Hispanic populations of the Cagayan Valley and Central Luzon Plain, the environmental and social consequences of this cultural encounter, conflict, and domination were traumatic. This chronic environmental destruction was primarily due to the advent of the encomienda system, where Spanish adventurers and settlers were granted the legal rights to extract forced labor from indigenous local people, and the government's system of forced labor and compulsory crop sales. These colonial policies and practices caused unprecedented economic pressures, transformed land use practices, and accelerated environmental risk and damage. The law of markets in Mexico and China took precedence over the stewardship of the natural world, and as a result, deforestation, erosion, and species extinction became more common. From northern Luzon to Cebu, ecosystems were damaged and degraded, setting the stage for future typhoon and flood-related disasters. Spanish mercantilist policies left many areas of the Philippines ecologically and economically vulnerable. Through the church, the Spanish rationalized and explained the social and environmental disruption and change as God's work, seeing themselves as foreordained to execute the plans of providence by divine will in the Philippines and the Americas.